My father, Richard Gray, was a vicar in the north of England who was respected by everybody who knew him. He lived quite well on a small salary and had a pleasant little house of his own. My mother was the daughter of a rich landowner, and she married my father against the wishes of her friends and family. If she became the poor vicar's wife, they told her, she would have to give up her carriage, her lady's maid, and the chance to live in a large, beautiful house. A carriage and a maid were certainly nice things to have, but luckily my mother had feet to carry her and hands to dress herself, and a large, beautiful house would be pleasant, but she would rather live in a cottage with Richard Gray than in a palace with any other man in the world. Her father told her that she could marry the vicar if she wanted to, but that if she did, she would lose her fortune. However, my mother was a strong woman who knew what she wanted, so the couple got married and my mother's fortune was given to her sister. Despite these difficulties and their simple life, I believe that you could search the whole of England and not find a couple who were happier than they were. My mother gave birth to 6 children, but my sister Mary and I were the only 2 that survived the dangers of early childhood. I was 6 years younger than Mary, so I was always a little spoiled because I was the baby of the family. We lived a very protected life, and my sister and I did not go to school. Instead, our mother, who was hard-working and very well educated, taught us at home. Sometimes we went to a tea party at a nearby house, or visited our father's parents and other elderly family members. Mostly, however, we heard about the world through the stories our mother told us about her younger days, and of carriages, parties, and big, elegant houses. While these stories entertained us, they often made me secretly wish that I could see more of the world. My mother seemed very happy and told her husband that she had everything that she needed in life. However, my father worried that his wife had given up too much in order to marry him. As a result, he was always thinking about how he could make more money. One day, a kind friend suggested to him a way of making a lot of money within just a few weeks. This friend was a merchant, a man who made money by buying and selling goods. If my father lent him some money, he said, he would make them both rich. My father took the chance and gave the man all the money he had. The friendly merchant used the money to buy goods and then arranged for them to be sent abroad on ships to be sold. My father was excited, and so were we all. We were going to be rich. We spent happy hours by the fire, talking about what we would do, where we would travel, and what we would buy with the money that would surely soon arrive. The weeks passed, but then the terrible news came. The ship, which contained the goods and therefore our fortune, had been caught in a terrible storm. It had sunk to the bottom of the sea, along with the goods it carried, and the unlucky merchant himself. I was young and did not understand how serious this loss was, but I could see how it had upset my parents, and this worried me. My mother concentrated on taking care of what little money we still had and on cheering up my father. He, on the other hand, lost all hope and became desperate. He believed that this recent poor decision had made his wife's life even worse. Over time, he became ill with the worry of it all, and none of us could give him any hope. We had a pony, a little horse, but we had to sell it. We stopped buying new clothes, and we used everything we had as carefully as we possibly could. My father dismissed one of our 2 servants, and my mother and sister began to help with the cooking. I offered to help too, but although I thought of myself as a young woman, I was still a child in the eyes of my family. My mother would send me away saying, "No, Agnes, there's nothing here you can do. It's much easier for me to do it myself. Go and help your sister." Then I would go to my sister and say, "Mary, Mother says that I should help you." To which Mary used to reply, "No, you are too young to help me, sweet Agnes. Go and play the piano or play with the cat." During this difficult time, I never once heard my mother complain. When the summer came, though, she and Mary talked about ways in which they could make a little more money. They wanted to give Father a much-needed holiday by the sea. "I wish I could do something," I said one day. "You, Agnes?" they both cried. "Yes, I've had an idea," I began nervously. "Really?" said my mother. "Tell us what it is." "I would like to be a governess," I replied quietly. My mother said nothing, and Mary, who had been holding a book, dropped it in surprise and cried, "You, Agnes, you want to be a governess?" "Well, yes, I don't think it's such a strange idea. Surely I could teach little children, and I think I would enjoy it. I like children," I explained. "Please let me, Mother." "My child," said my mother kindly, "you have not learnt to take care of yourself yet. Young children need someone who is experienced to look after them." "But I am 18 now," I told her, "and I can take care of myself and others too. You do not know how capable I am because I haven't had a chance to try. Just let me try, that is all I ask of you." At that moment, my father came into the room and heard about my idea. He agreed that I was not ready to become a governess and gently said that I was too young to leave home. The subject was not mentioned again, but I could think of nothing else. How wonderful it would be to be a governess, to go out into the world, to start a new life, to make my own decisions, to earn my own money, and give some help to my family, to show them what little Agnes could do. I felt sure that I would be a good governess. 3 or 4 days later, I mentioned the idea again to my mother. With some difficulty, I persuaded her to speak to my father. It was not long before my father and sister had warmed to the idea, and my mother began to look for a job for me. After a few weeks, I was offered the job of taking care of the young family of Mrs. Bloomfield, who was a friend of one of our distant family members. The salary was only £25 a year, and my parents advised me not to take the job. However, I had no other job offers, and because I was young and wanted to work, I happily accepted the offer. Several weeks of preparation followed, and I could not wait to start my new job. Finally, September came, and my new clothes had been made, and my bags had been packed. I had taken my last walk with Mary, I had sung my last song to my father, and I had said goodbye to the little cat. When it was time to go to bed, and I saw my empty cupboards, I suddenly felt nervous and wondered if I had made the right decision. But in the morning, I felt excited again. I washed, dressed, ate breakfast, and kissed my family goodbye. I climbed up into the small, open carriage and waved to my mother and sister as the carriage began to move away down the hill. Then, and not before then, I burst into tears. The journey was cold and long, and it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon when I arrived at Wellwood House. As the carriage moved through the large gates and the impressive house and gardens came into view, I began to feel very nervous. There was no going back now. How would I introduce myself? What would my new life be like? I hoped that Mrs. Bloomfield was a kind, generous woman, and that I would get on well with the children. Be calm, whatever happens, I said to myself as I entered the house and met Mrs. Bloomfield for the first time. She was a tall, serious-looking woman with thick black hair, cold grey eyes, and very pale skin. I was so nervous that I almost forgot to reply when she introduced herself. She showed me my bedroom and then told me to come down for lunch in a few minutes. With some difficulty, I found my way into the dining room where some lunch had been put out on a long table. As I ate, she sat opposite me, watching me and asking a few questions. When she spoke quite formally, and most of the time I ate in silence. When I had finished eating, she led me into the sitting room. She rang a bell, and when a servant appeared, she asked for the children to be brought to meet me. "I think they are clever children," said Mrs. Bloomfield, as we waited for them to arrive. "And very keen to learn, especially the little boy. He is generous and always tells the truth." I was pleased to hear this good news. "His sister, Mary Ann," she continued, "is generally a very good girl, but you will need to watch her carefully." At that moment, my 2 young pupils came into the room. Master Tom Bloomfield was a handsome, tall boy of about 7, with fair hair, blue eyes, and a small turned-up nose. Mary Ann, who was a year or so younger than her brother, was also a tall girl for her age. She was dark-haired like her mother, but with a round face and pink cheeks. We spent a few minutes talking, and I saw that they seemed to be very confident, lively children. Mrs. Bloomfield then suggested that Master Tom should show me where I would teach them, and so he led the way to the schoolroom. As soon as we were in the schoolroom, the children began to argue with each other, and Tom pushed his sister roughly. This was very shocking, but I hoped that in time I would be able to change their behaviour. Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, Mrs. Bloomfield talked to me again. She told me in great detail about her wonderful children, what they must learn, and how I should manage them. At about 9:30, she invited me to eat a supper of cold meat and bread. I was glad when that was over, and I was able to return to my room. Although I really wanted to like her, I could not help feeling that she was cold, serious, and even a little frightening, the very opposite of the kind, gentle woman I had hoped she would be. Despite the disappointments of the previous day, I woke up the next morning feeling excited and hopeful. I was going to spend my first morning in the schoolroom with the children. However, the morning turned out to be full of challenges. Tom, although he seemed quite clever, was very lazy. Mary Ann could hardly read at all and kept looking out of the window or walking away. We had made very little progress by the end of the lesson.
"Now you must put on your coat,"
Tom told me.
"I want to show you the garden."
"I'm not sure that's a good idea," I told him. "It looks like it's going to rain and—"
"That doesn't matter,"
he interrupted.
"You have to come with us, and I won't allow any excuses,"
he added rudely. It was our first day together, and I did not want to get into an argument, so I agreed to go with the children. The garden was large and beautiful, but I was not allowed any time to admire it. Instead, I was taken to a distant corner of the garden. There, Tom showed me different traps he had made to catch birds and other small animals. He proudly told me how he liked to cut the birds up with a knife or pull off their wings.
"Don't you know it is extremely wicked to do those things to animals?"
I cried, shocked by what he had told me.
"Oh, what nonsense," he replied. "Father knows what I do to them, and he says it's just what he used to do when he was a boy."
"Well, I still think it is wrong," I told him. "And you will certainly not hurt any animals as long as I have the power to prevent it." Next, they took me to a pond, a small area of water, in the corner of the garden. Mary Ann started to throw stones into the water. The children's clothes became wet and dirty, and I told them to come away from the pond. But I had no control over them. They did exactly what they wanted to, and ignored what I said to them. After a few minutes of trying to persuade them to leave the pond, I suddenly saw a man riding a horse towards us. He shouted loudly to the children,
"Get out of that water!"
Then he came towards me.
"I suppose you are Miss Grey," he said coldly. "I'm surprised that you were allowing them to get their clothes dirty like this. Can't you see that Miss Bloomfield has dirt on her dress, and that Master Bloomfield's socks are wet? I request that in future you at least keep their clothes clean."
Then he turned and continued his ride up to the house. This must be Mr. Bloomfield. I was surprised that he had called his young children Miss and Master, and I was shocked that he had not spoken to me in a more polite way. When the children and I were called into the dining room for lunch, I saw him again. He was quite a short man, and was rather thin. He was between 30 and 40 years of age. He had a large mouth, pale skin, dull blue eyes, and the sort of hair which is neither fair nor brown. During lunch, he complained about the food, said the kitchen servants were lazy, and told his wife that she was not even capable of organising a meal.
"Perhaps, Mr. Bloomfield, you will order lunch yourself in future,"
she told him angrily. Nothing more was said, and I was very glad to leave the room with the children. I was not used to hearing people talk to each other in this way. I had never felt so embarrassed and uncomfortable in my life. In the afternoon, I tried to teach Tom and Mary Ann once more. Then they took me outside again. Then we ate supper together in the schoolroom. Much later, when they had gone down to see their parents, I had some time to myself at last. I sat down and started to write a letter to my lovely family, but the children came back upstairs before I had finished it. At 7 o'clock, I had to put Mary Ann to bed, and then I played with Tom until he went to bed at 8. Then I finished my letter and spent some time hanging up my clothes, something I had not yet managed to do. Finally, I got into bed, and because I was so tired, I fell asleep in just a few minutes. I did not know it at the time, but this had been a good day compared to many of the days that would follow.